Hi viewers, welcome back to MasterJSkills. In today's video, we will explore about the Spring Boot JPA. So please watch the video without skipping for more clear understanding, and make sure to subscribe to MasterJSkills for more such great content. So without making much delay, let's see what is the Spring Boot JPA. Spring Boot JPA is a Java specification for managing relational data in Java application. It simplifies the process of accessing and storing data between Java objects or classes, and relational databases. JPA follows a object relational mapping principle, providing a set of interfaces that makes it easy to work with a database. So JPA is a persistent API for implementing ORM. So that is object relational mapping, means mapping between objects and databases. So one of the key component of a Spring Boot JPA is the Entity Manager API. It is a runtime tool that enables developers to perform queries and transactions on objects stored in the database. With the Entity Manager API, developer can efficiently interact with the database without worrying about the underlying implementation details. So with the Spring Boot JPA here, the Entity Manager API itself will perform the queries and the transaction on the object that we want to store into the database. Here we need not to worry about the implementation. We can just make use of a Entity Manager, Spring Boot JPA Entity Manager. We will see how we will be utilizing this Entity Manager API with the help of our application, or with in a practical example. So the Spring Boot JPA also includes the Java Persistent Query Language, that is JPQL, Java Persistent Query Language. So Hibernate includes HQL, whereas Spring Boot JPA includes JPQL, that is Java Persistent Query Language, which is a query language specifically designed for JPA. So JPQL allows the developers to write object-oriented queries to retrieve data from the database. To perform any queries on the data, so Spring JPA uses JPQL, which will be querying on objects instead of directly querying on the database. So it's a kind of a HQL. It's a convenient way to fetch the information needed for a various application requirements. So JPA is not a framework. It defines a concept that can be implemented by any framework. So basically JPA is a concept that can be implemented on any framework. For example, we will be implementing it on the Spring Boot framework or the Spring framework. So let's see the JPA architecture. So persistent, so you can see the Entity Manager API itself will handle all the queries. So persistence created during application startup. So once the application started, persistent API will be created. From that, Entity Manager factory will create, and then from that Entity Manager will create, and then our entity, that object that persists into the database with the help of Entity Manager. So with the help of Entity Manager, entity will be created that will be persisted into the database. So here you can see with the Entity Manager factory, so is a Entity Manager factory will be create the persistent unit, so which is unit of work with a database that will be working with an unit of work, like one by one it will be persisted by the Entity Manager factory. Entity Manager factory will create the persistent unit. We will see each one of them here, and Entity Manager will create entity, transaction and query. So this entity transaction will live for a shorter time, that is resides inside the session object. So let's see each one of them. So JPA architecture contains the following. Persistent, it's a class that contains static methods to obtain an entity manager factory instance. So this is a class which will obtain a entity manager factory. Entity manager factory is a factory class of an entity manager. It creates and manages multiple instances of a entity manager. So multiple instances of entity manager will be managed by the entity manager factory. Next is entity manager is an interface. It controls the persistence operation on objects. It works for the query instances. So for a persistent operation, entity manager is used. So entity are a persistent objects to be stored as a record in the database. This is the entity which is a persistent object. So next is persistence unit. It defines a set of all entity classes. So it defines all the entity classes. In an application, entity manager instances manage it. The set of entity classes represent the data contained within the single data store. So persistent unit contains all the entity classes. Next is entity transaction. It has a one-to-one relationship with the entity manager. For each entity manager, operations are maintained by the entity transaction. So all the transactions are managed by the entity transaction itself. Entity manager transactions are managed by the entity transaction. Next is query. So query is an interface that is implemented by each JPA vendor to obtain relational objects that meet the criteria. So you can see the flow, the persistent class to entity manager factory class to entity manager to entity. So this is a complete flow. In between them, persistent unit, because it will fetch all the required entities and the transaction on each particular entity and querying handled by the by the entity manager. So this is a JPA architecture. Now let's see what's the difference between JPA and Hibernate. So JPA is a Java specification that is used to access, manage and persist data between Java object and relational database. It is a standard approach for ORM. So it's a Java specification to persist the data between Java objects and database. So whereas Hibernate is a lightweight open source ORM tool, it's a standard ORM approach, whereas JPA is a specification, whereas Hibernate is an ORM tool that is used to store a Java objects in a relational database system. It is a provider for JPA. Hibernate is a provider for JPA. It follows a common approach provided by JPA. So it's a provider for JPA. JPA is a Java specification. Next is JPA uses a platform independent query language called a JPQL, Java Persistent Query Language, whereas Hibernate uses its own query language, that is Hibernate Query Language. JPA uses an entity manager for handling the persistence of a data, whereas Hibernate uses a session for handling the persistence of a data. So here entity manager is used, whereas in session is used in Hibernate. So these are the difference between JPA and Hibernate. So now let's see how we can implement a Spring Boot JPA into Spring Boot application. So for that, Spring Boot Starter Data JPA is used. The Spring Boot provides a starter dependency called a Spring Boot Starter Data JPA to connect Spring Boot application with a relational database effectively. The Spring Boot Starter Data JPA internally uses a Spring Boot JPA dependency itself. So we have to include this dependency. So for that, we will see the JPA repository. Let's see in the application to enable Spring Boot JPA. So I have included this starter, Spring Boot Starter Data JPA. Let's see how we have implemented with the repository. So you can see JPA repository in the repository. So employee repository extends JPA repository. So let's see what are the JPA repository. JPA repository is a JPA that is Java Persistent API specific extension for repository. It's a extension for a repository. It contains the full API of a CRUD repository and paging and storing repository. So it contains API for basic CRUD operation and also API for paging and sorting. So whenever application is specifically for CRUD operation or paging or sorting, then no need of including our own repository layer. So we can directly use a JPA repository for these basic operations. So for this, for example, department repository extend JPA repository department, and here is a ID. So you can see for EMS application, that is employee management system, I have used employee repository extend JPA repository, and employee we have to pass employee entity we have to include with the ID. So our ID is of type integer, that we have to specify here. So what are the methods it contains? It contains save all, to save all the entities, get by ID, flush, save and flush, delete all in batch. So these are basic methods I have shown, I have listed here. So let's see directly in the class itself. So implementation I'll be opening. So for this, you can see this is an interface, extends pagination and query by example executor. There are lots of things here. For these basic operations, no need to query anything, even on objects or else on external database. So we can just call those methods which will internally create. So you can see JPA implementation, simple query, these two are there. So let's open our service. So here I have used find all. You can see find all. Find all is used. Let's see the implementation. So here you can see find all has a get query. So we are just calling it, nothing else we are doing. Everything it will do internally. So it will create a query and fetch to the database, and internally it is using criteria builder. So to create query, and that query will be applied with some criteria, and we'll be selecting and sorting, and that will be returned to the caller method. So it will send list of employees. How it is giving employee, because we have passing this entity to the JPA repository. So it will do all the operation on this particular entity and it's a ID. So this is how the JPA repository will work. So here here the developer task made it much easier without querying. So these are the basic operation what we can do it. So this is all about JPA repository. This is how we can implement a Spring Boot JPA. Just include if we want other class, like how we can implement address class. So address JPA, and we have to include entity, and that's all. So because why I am using JPA repository is because of a CRUD operation. What I am using is a find all and find by ID, save, delete by ID. So these all the methods I'm using. Let's see what all the methods it has. There's this find all with sort, find by ID, list, save all, flush, save and flush, delete batch, delete all in batch, get one, find all. So find all with a different sorting and different things are there. So they have given these all are the methods the JPA repository has given, and with the help of this we can do the CRUD operation easily. So this is how we can implement a Spring Boot JPA into the Spring Boot application. And that's quite simple. Include the dependency, starter dependency and implement, just extend this JPA repository and include your entity, which will map to the database, and and inject that particular repository into the service and just call those methods. So no need of writing the queries in the Spring Boot starter, Spring Boot JPA. So that's all about the Spring Boot JPA. So if you still have any doubts, please drop in the comment box. I'll make sure to clear all your doubts. So if you like this tutorial, please like this video and subscribe to MasterJSkills and press the bell icon to get all the updates. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.